The holographic display flickered with contempt as Admiral Vexithara leaned back in her command throne aboard the Dominion's Fist. Through the crystalline viewport, the pathetic collection of vessels hung in space like discarded toys. 7 small ships, barely larger than escort frigates, drifting in formation near the contested asteroid field of Kepler 442c. "These are the legendary human defenders?" scoffed Commander Kilvaros, his 6 eyes gleaming with amusement. The bridge crew of the hegemony dreadnought erupted in chittering laughter, their mandibles clicking in synchronized mockery. "I've seen cargo haulers with more impressive weapon arrays." Vexithara's tentacles writhed with satisfaction as she studied the tactical readout. Her fleet of 12 heavy cruisers and 4 dreadnoughts represented the full might of the Zephyrian hegemony. Over 3 million tons of hardened durasteel and enough firepower to glass a planet. The human fleet registered barely 50,000 tons combined. "Open a communication channel," she commanded, her voice carrying the authority of a species that had conquered 14 star systems. "Let's see what these creatures have to say for themselves." The main screen shimmered, revealing the bridge of what appeared to be the lead human vessel. A weathered figure sat calmly in the captain's chair, his steel-gray eyes betraying no fear despite facing impossible odds. His uniform bore no familiar insignia, and his name badge read simply, "Captain Dre Corvin. This is Admiral Vexithara of the Zephyrian hegemony. You are trespassing in claimed territory. Surrender your vessels immediately, and we may consider allowing your escape pods to reach the nearest habitable world." Captain Corvin's expression remained unchanged as he leaned forward slightly. "Admiral, this is Captain Corvin of the Tenacious Dawn. This asteroid field contains rare Earth elements vital to human colonies. We cannot comply with your demand." The bridge of the Dominion's Fist exploded in derisive laughter. Several officers had to steady themselves against their consoles as they wheezed with mirth. "You cannot comply?" Vexithara repeated, her voice dripping with disbelief. "Captain, perhaps your species lacks the capacity for mathematical reasoning. You are facing 21 warships with a combined mass 18 times greater than your entire flotilla. Your largest vessel barely qualifies as a destroyer by our standards." "Numbers don't tell the whole story, Admiral," Corvin replied evenly. "We've learned that lesson well." Behind him, his crew moved with quiet efficiency. No panic, no desperate shouting, just professional calm that seemed almost eerie given their situation. One of his officers, a woman with intricate braided hair, looked up from her console and nodded once. "Last warning, humans," Vexithara snarled, her patience evaporating. "You have 60 seconds to begin your surrender, or we will demonstrate why the hegemony rules this sector of space." "Admiral," Corvin said softly, "before you proceed, I think there's something you should know about us." He gestured to someone. Off-screen and slowly, deliberately, a flag began to rise behind him. Not the expected banner of a human colony or corporation, but something else entirely. The laughter on the hegemony bridge began to die as officers squinted at their screens, trying to make out the details of the unfurling standard. It was simple in design. A field of deep blue with a single white star surrounded by a ring of smaller stars, and beneath it, text in both human script and galactic standard. When the full banner came into view, Commander Kilvaros felt his blood run cold. The words at the bottom were clear: Terran Federation Navy, Ghost Fleet Division. The bridge fell silent. "Oh no," whispered one of the junior officers. "Those aren't colonists." Admiral Vexithara's tentacles went rigid as the implications hit her. Every spacefaring species in the galaxy had heard the stories, whispered tales, of human military units that had vanished during the war, presumed destroyed, only to resurface years later in impossible places. Ships that fought with suicidal fury, crews that never retreated, captains who turned losing battles into Pyrrhic victories. Captain Corvin's smile was thin and sharp. "Admiral, meet the survivors of Battle Group Omega. We've been wondering when someone would finally find us." The silence stretched across the void as Admiral BlackHFY processed what she was seeing. The Ghost Fleet Division, she had dismissed those stories as propaganda, tales meant to boost human morale during their desperate early wars. Yet here they were, flying colors that officially didn't exist, in ships that had been declared lost with all hands 5 years ago. "Impossible!" she hissed, her tentacles coiling tighter around her command throne. "Battle Group Omega was destroyed at the Battle of Crimson Nebula. We have sensor records of their annihilation." Captain Corvin's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, a memory of pain so deep it had carved itself into his soul. "We were supposed to die there, Admiral. The plan required it. 700 ships went into that nebula. 7 came out. On the tactical display, the human vessels seemed to shift subtly, their formation tightening in a way that spoke of countless battles fought together. These weren't random survivors. They were the remnant of something much larger, much more dangerous. "You're bluffing," Commander Kilvaros interjected, though his voice lacked conviction. 7 ships cannot threaten our fleet." "7 ships," repeated Lieutenant Kira Voss from the communications station aboard the Tenacious Dawn, her fingers dancing across holographic controls. "Captain, they're still underestimating us." "They always do, Kira." Corvin stood slowly, his movements deliberate. "Admiral, I'm going to tell you a story. It's about what happens when you back humans into a corner and kill everyone they love." The display behind him lit up with tactical schematics, not of current positions, but of past battles. The Battle of Crimson Nebula unfolded in holographic detail, showing how the human fleet had been systematically destroyed by a coalition of alien forces. "We were expendable," Corvin continued, his voice carrying the weight of survivors' guilt. "A distraction while the main evacuation fleets escaped. 700 ships, 40,000 souls, all deemed acceptable losses. But we had families on those evacuation ships, Admiral. Children, lovers, parents." The schematics shifted, showing the aftermath. How 7 damaged vessels had limped away from the slaughter, their crews forever changed by what they had witnessed. "You want to know what we learned in that nebula?" Corvin asked, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "We learned that when you have nothing left to lose, you can achieve impossible things." Aboard the Dominion's Fist, sensor operator Zixandra suddenly straightened at her console. "Admiral, I'm reading anomalous energy signatures from the human vessels. Their reactors they're doing something I've never seen before." BlackHFY whipped around to examine the readings herself. The human ships were indeed generating power levels that should have been impossible for vessels of their size. But more disturbing was the pattern. Coordinated, synchronized, as if all 7 ships were components of a single massive system. "What are you doing?" she demanded, turning back to the communication screen. Captain Corvin looked directly into the camera, and for the first time, his calm facade cracked slightly, revealing the burning intensity beneath. "We're about to show you why Ghost Fleet got its name, Admiral. You see, when you strip everything away from a group of humans, their homes, their loved ones, their hope, you don't get surrender. You get something far more dangerous." Behind him, the crew of the Tenacious Dawn worked with mechanical precision. They had performed this dance before, in desperate battles across forgotten star systems. Each crew member had long since made peace with death. They fought now not for survival, but for something harder to define, a promise to the dead, perhaps, or simply the need to prove that their sacrifice had meaning. "Engine output at maximum," reported Chief Engineer Nix Valdris from below decks. "All systems are ready for Protocol 7. "Protocol 7? Kilvaros looked confused. "What is Protocol 7? Corvin's smile was cold as winter space. "Something we developed after Crimson Nebula. Something we've had 5 years to perfect. while hunting pirates and raiders in the Outer Rim. You might call it creative problem-solving. The 7 human ships suddenly moved, not toward the hegemony fleet, but away from each other, spreading out in a pattern that made no tactical sense. They were making themselves easier targets, more vulnerable. "They're retreating," laughed one of the hegemony officers. "No," Vexithara said slowly, a chill running down her spine as she watched the display. "They're positioning." The dance of death began with mathematical precision. As the 7 human ships spread across a spherical formation spanning nearly 50,000 kilometers, Admiral Vexithara finally understood why they called it the Ghost Fleet. These weren't conventional military vessels anymore. They were something unprecedented, forged in the crucible of impossible survival. "Target their engines first," she commanded, her voice sharp with growing unease. "Disable them before they can—" "Admiral," Zixandra interrupted, her multiple eyes wide with shock. "Their energy signatures just spiked beyond measurement. Each ship is generating the power output of a battle station." Captain Corvin's voice carried across the comm channel with eerie calm. "You asked what we learned in the nebula, Admiral. We learned that conventional tactics are for people who have something to lose. We learned that when you're already dead, you can do things that would terrify the living." The first hegemony salvo lanced out, a barrage of plasma bolts that should have crippled the lead human vessel. Instead, something impossible happened. The tenacious dawn flickered, its hull seeming to phase in and out of reality for a split second. The plasma bolts passed harmlessly through empty space. "What in the void?" Kilvaros started. "Phase manipulation," whispered Chief Science Officer Mordak, her mandibles clicking rapidly in distress. "But that technology is theoretical. The power requirements alone would kill a normal crew," Corvin finished. "Lucky for us, we stopped being normal 5 years ago." The truth was more horrifying than the hegemony could have imagined. The survivors of Battle Group Omega had indeed died in the Crimson Nebula, not physically but in every way that mattered. They had been reborn as something else, their bodies modified by desperate medical procedures that traded lifespan for capability, their ships rebuilt with technology that demanded terrible prices. Lieutenant Kira Voss felt the familiar burn in her neural pathways as she linked directly with the ship's tactical systems. The cybernetic implants that allowed her to process information at superhuman speeds were slowly killing her, just as they had killed 12 others before her. But they gave her reaction times that made human reflexes look glacial. "Phase sync achieved," she reported, her voice flat as the implants suppressed her emotions to prevent system overload. "All ships reporting ready." Chief Engineer Nix Valdris monitored the reactor from her position deep in the ship's bowels, watching as the containment fields held energies that should have vaporized them all. The modifications they had made to their power systems violated 3 different laws of physics, but they worked at the cost of irreversible cellular damage to anyone within 50 meters of the core. "Reactor stable at 1200%. Normal output," she reported, ignoring the blood trickling from her nose. Estimated time to containment failure: 47 minutes. It was always a race against time now. Every battle was a countdown to their own destruction, but that's what made them so dangerous. They fought like beings who had already accepted death. The hegemony fleet opened fire in earnest, thousands of weapon bursts creating a web of destruction across space. But the human ships moved like ghosts, phasing partially out of normal space-time whenever critical hits approached. They couldn't maintain the effect for long, the power drain was enormous, but they only needed moments. "How are they doing this?" Vexithara snarled. On the tenacious dawn, Captain Corvin felt the familiar weight of command that had nearly broken him countless times. Every order he gave sent his people deeper into the abyss, burned away more of their humanity. But they followed him anyway, because they understood the alternative. "Fire pattern Omega," he commanded. The 7 ships synchronized their weapon systems in a display that would have been beautiful if it weren't so deadly. They had learned to fight as a single organism, each vessel a neuron in a distributed military, brain. Their weapons fire wasn't scattered across multiple targets. It was concentrated with surgical precision on specific points of the hegemony formation. The first hegemony cruiser died without warning as 7 different beam weapons converged on its reactor. The containment field collapsed, and the ship vanished in a brief star. "Impossible," breathed Chilvaros. "The targeting precision required is what happens when you wire human brains directly into targeting computers," Corvin said softly. "When you accept that your crew will die from neural feedback within 2 years, you can achieve remarkable things." The second cruiser tried to maneuver away from the combined fire, but the Ghost Fleet predicted its movement patterns with uncanny accuracy. The ship died as its bridge was surgically removed by a precisely targeted antimatter torpedo. Admiral Vexithara watched in growing horror as her overwhelming numerical advantage began to crumble. These weren't ships fighting her. This was a single, terrifyingly coordinated entity that happened to be spread across 7 hulls. "All vessels, concentrate fire on their flagship," she ordered desperately. The response was immediate and devastating. Every weapon in the hegemony fleet targeted. The tenacious Dawn, a barrage that should have reduced it to component atoms. But as the plasma and particle beams reached their target, the ship simply wasn't there anymore. It had phased completely out of normal space, existing in a quantum state that defied conventional physics. For 30 seconds, the tenacious Dawn was effectively a ghost, untouchable by conventional weapons. When it phased back into reality, Captain Corvin was smiling. "Your turn," he said quietly. The Dominion's fist shuddered as coordinated fire from all 7 human vessels converged on its forward weapon arrays. Admiral Vexithara felt her confidence evaporating as she watched her flagship's primary guns melt under the precisely targeted assault. "Status report," she demanded, her tentacles lashing with frustration. "Forward weapons offline. Hull breaches on decks 7 through 12, reported her damage control officer. "Admiral, their targeting precision is beyond anything in our tactical databases. They're hitting specific components with surgical accuracy." On the bridge of the tenacious Dawn, Lieutenant Kira Voss felt her consciousness expanding across the quantum battlefield. The neural implants that allowed her to interface directly with the ship's systems were burning through her brain tissue, creating microscopic scars that would eventually prove fatal. But right now, she could see the battle from 7 different perspectives simultaneously, process targeting solutions faster than any computer, and coordinate attacks within human precision. "Target their command decks next," Captain Corvin ordered, his voice steady despite the blood trickling from his eyes, a side effect of the combat stims that kept his enhanced reflexes functioning at superhuman levels. "Acknowledged," Kira replied, her voice becoming more mechanical as the implants took greater control. "Targeting solutions computed. All ships report ready." The Ghost Fleet had learned to fight dirty during their years in the Outer Rim. Conventional military doctrine focused on destroying enemy vessels through massive damage to critical systems. But when you were outnumbered 20 to 1, you couldn't afford such inefficiency. Instead, they had developed tactics that targeted specific individuals: bridge crews, senior officers, key specialists. 7 precisely aimed particle beams lanced out, each one calculated to penetrate the command deck of a different hegemony vessel. The results were devastating in their surgical precision. Bridge after bridge exploded as superheated plasma vaporized command crews, leaving the surviving ships with junior officers who had never trained for fleet-level combat. "They're headhunting," whispered Commander Kilvaros, his face pale as he watched 3 more cruisers drift out of formation, their command structures decapitated. "They're specifically targeting our senior staff." Captain Corvin turned to Chief Engineer Nix Valdris's voice over the intercom. "Captain, reactor output is becoming unstable. We're pushing beyond safe parameters." "How long?" Corvin asked. 23 minutes before cascade failure, Nix replied, her voice hoarse from radiation exposure. Down in the engine room, she monitored systems that glowed with barely contained fury. The modifications they had made to their reactors allowed them to channel impossible amounts of power, but at a cost that grew steeper with each battle. Understood. All ships, prepare for endgame protocol. The phrase sent a chill through the Ghost Fleet crews. Endgame protocol was their final gambit, a tactic so dangerous that it guaranteed their own destruction, but could eliminate enemy fleets 10 times their size. They had used it only twice before, and each time had cost them crew members who couldn't be replaced. Aboard the Valiant Sword, Commander Reyes Kellerton felt the familiar mixture of pride and despair that came with serving in the Ghost Fleet. His ship was the smallest of the 7, a modified corvette that should never have survived the Crimson Nebula. But it had, along with 37 crew members who had chosen to follow him into the abyss. "Sir," reported his tactical officer, a young woman whose name he had stopped using months ago when the memory implants began consuming her personality, "the Hegemony fleet is attempting to withdraw." Indeed, Admiral Vex Thara had finally grasped the true nature of her opponents. These weren't normal humans fighting a conventional battle. They were something far more dangerous. They were myths given flesh, legends powered by grief and sustained by the knowledge that they were already dead. "Signal general retreat," she commanded. "Full emergency burn. Get us out of—" The transmission cut off as the Dominion's fist lurched violently. Through the viewport, Vexithara saw something that defied belief. The 7 human ships were accelerating directly toward her fleet, their hulls beginning to glow with barely contained energy. "They're overloading their reactors," Zixandra reported, in horror. "All 7 ships are preparing for reactor breach." But it wasn't suicide. It was something far more sophisticated and terrifying. As the Ghost Fleet ships accelerated past the point where their hulls should have failed, they began to phase in and out of normal space with increasing frequency. The effect created a quantum resonance that amplified their reactor outputs exponentially. Captain Corvin stood on his bridge, watching the stars streak past as his ship exceeded its design limits by factors that should have been impossible. Around him, his crew worked with the focused intensity of the damned, each one accepting their fate with the stoic calm that had defined the Ghost Fleet since Crimson Nebula. "All hands prepare for quantum cascade," he announced over the ship's intercom. "It has been an honor serving with you all." The response came back from 6 other ships, each captain echoing the same words that had become their battle cry. "For those who cannot be forgotten." As the Ghost Fleet reached terminal velocity, their quantum fields began to merge, creating a resonance effect that would either destroy them all or tear a hole in space-time itself. In the engine rooms of all 7 ships, reactors pushed beyond their breaking points began to sing with the voice of dying stars. Admiral Vexithara watched in horrified fascination as the human ships transformed into something that existed only partially in her reality, their hulls flickering between solid matter and pure energy. When they finally struck her fleet, it wasn't with conventional weapons, it was with the force of controlled stellar collapse. The first Hegemony dreadnought didn't simply die, it ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. As the tenacious Dawn phased through the massive vessel's hull at 90% light speed, the quantum field surrounding Captain Corvin's ship created a cascading failure in local space-time. The dreadnought's matter was converted directly to energy in a process that violated several fundamental laws of physics, but which the Ghost Fleet had perfected through bitter necessity. Admiral Vexithara watched her flagship's sister ship simply vanish. Not explode, not break apart. Vanish, leaving only a brief flare of exotic radiation that made her sensors scream. "What have they done?" she whispered, her tentacles trembling as she witnessed something that shouldn't have been possible. The answer came from the quantum resonance field that now surrounded the battle zone. The 7 ships of the Ghost Fleet had synchronized their phase transitions so perfectly that they had created a localized distortion in the fabric of reality itself. They weren't just fighting in space anymore. They were fighting with space as a weapon. Lieutenant Kira Voss felt her consciousness fragmenting as the neural implants in her brain processed impossible amounts of data. She was simultaneously experiencing the battle from 7 different perspectives while calculating quantum mechanics equations that would have required supercomputers under normal circumstances. Blood streamed from her nose and ears, but her voice remained steady as she coordinated the impossible. Phase resonance stable, she reported, though speaking had become an exercise in agony. All ships maintaining quantum coherence. On the stalwart. Fury! Commander Lyra Vex felt her ship buckling under stresses that should have torn it apart years ago. The hull modifications they had made after Crimson Nebula allowed the vessel to exist in multiple quantum states simultaneously, but each transition burned away more of the ship's structural integrity. Hull stress at 400% of design specifications, her chief engineer reported, his voice calm despite the fact that he was reporting their imminent destruction. Estimated time to structural failure, 11 minutes. More than enough, Lyra replied, her augmented reflexes allowing her to navigate through a hegemony formation at impossible speeds. The Ghost Fleet had long since abandoned conventional notions of self-preservation. They were living weapons now, guided missiles with human souls, and their only purpose was to achieve maximum destruction before their inevitable end. The second dreadnought tried to target the phasing human ships with weapons designed to disrupt quantum fields, but the Ghost Fleet had anticipated this. As the anti-phase batteries opened fire, all 7 ships suddenly materialized in normal space around the massive vessel, surrounding it in a perfect sphere. Now, Captain Corvin commanded. 7. Reactor cores, each one pushed beyond its theoretical limits, began to resonate at precisely calculated frequencies. The effect wasn't an explosion. It was something far more sophisticated. The quantum field surrounding each ship merged into a single coherent wave that propagated outward at the speed of light. When the wave struck the dreadnought, it didn't destroy the ship's matter. It convinced the universe that the ship had never existed in the first place. The massive vessel simply faded from reality, leaving behind only confused radiation patterns and the terrified screams of the surviving hegemony crews. "They're rewriting local physics," breathed Commander Kilvaros, his 6 eyes wide with terror. How is this possible? The answer lay in the modifications the Ghost Fleet had made to themselves and their ships during 5 years of desperate warfare in the Outer Rim. They had discovered that certain exotic matter configurations could create localized anomalies in space-time, but only at the cost of the operators' lives. Normal crews would have refused such modifications, but the survivors of Battle Group Omega had already died once. What was left were echoes powered by purpose. Chief Engineer Nix Valdris monitored the tenacious Dawn's reactor from her position deep within the ship's core. The radiation levels around her would have killed an unaugmented human within seconds, but the cybernetic organs that had replaced most of her internal systems allowed her to function in conditions that resembled the heart of a star. "Reactor output at 1800% normal capacity," she reported. Her voice transmitted through quantum resonance since conventional communications would have been impossible in the energy storm surrounding her. Estimated time to cascade. Failure. 6 minutes, 12 seconds. Understood, Corvin replied. Around him, his bridge crew worked with the mechanical precision of the dying. They had known since Crimson Nebula that they were living on borrowed time, and each battle consumed more of what remained of their humanity. The third hegemony dreadnought attempted to ram the Ghost Fleet formation, its captain apparently deciding that a glorious death in battle was preferable to witnessing more impossible physics. But the human ship simply phased out of normal space-time as the massive vessel approached, allowing it to pass harmlessly through their positions before rematerializing behind it. "Your turn," whispered Captain Corvin, and 7 ships opened fire simultaneously. But these weren't conventional weapons anymore. The Ghost Fleet had learned to weaponize quantum uncertainty itself, firing coherent streams of possibility that convinced targeted matter that it had already been destroyed. The dreadnought's hull began to unravel at the molecular level, its atoms forgetting how to maintain their bonds. Admiral Vexithara watched in growing horror as her fleet was systematically erased by an enemy force 1/18th their size. This wasn't warfare. It was something approaching divine retribution, delivered by beings who had transcended conventional mortality. "Signal all remaining vessels," she commanded, her voice hollow with defeat. "Emergency withdrawal. Full power to engines. Get us away from this cursed place." But as the surviving hegemony ships began their retreat, they discovered that the Ghost Fleet had one final surprise waiting for them. The quantum resonance field that surrounded the battle zone had been carefully calibrated to prevent faster-than-light travel. They were trapped in normal space with beings who had weaponized death itself. Captain Corvin stood on his bridge, watching the fleeing enemy vessels with eyes that had seen too much. His crew was dying around him, their augmented bodies finally, succumbing to the impossible stresses they had endured. But they had accomplished their mission. Not just defeating a superior force, but creating a legend that would echo across the galaxy. "All ships," he commanded, for what he knew would be the last time, "prepare for final phase transition." The quantum field surrounding the battle zone pulsed like a dying heartbeat as the Ghost Fleet prepared for their final act. Admiral Vexithara's remaining ships, 8 cruisers and 2 damaged dreadnoughts, hung motionless in space, their faster-than-light drives disabled by the resonance cascade that had transformed this region of space into something that resembled the inside of a stellar core more than empty vacuum. "Admiral," Zixandra reported, her voice tight with fear, "the quantum distortion is intensifying. If they push it any further, they might create a permanent rift in space-time." Vexithara stared at the tactical display, watching as the 7 human vessels began their final convergence. Each ship was now glowing with barely contained energy, their hulls flickering between solid matter and pure possibility. She had spent her entire career conquering lesser species, breaking their resistance through superior firepower and tactical excellence. But this was something beyond her experience. On the bridge of the tenacious Dawn, Captain Corvin felt the familiar weight of command settling over him like a burial shroud. Around him, his crew worked with the focused intensity of the dying. Their augmented bodies pushed far beyond safe operating parameters. Lieutenant Kira Voss's neural implants had finally begun cascading failures, leaving her partially paralyzed, but still connected to the ship's tactical systems. Chief Engineer Nix Valdris was dying from radiation poisoning, her cybernetic organs, slowly shutting down as the reactor's exotic emissions overwhelmed even her enhanced physiology. "Status report," Corvin requested, though he already knew the answer. "All ships reporting critical system failures across the board," Kira managed, her voice distorted by the failing implants. "Estimated time to total system collapse, 4 minutes, 18 seconds. "More than enough," Corvin replied, then opened a channel to the surviving hegemony fleet. "Admiral Vexithara, this is Captain Corvin. I'm transmitting our final message. To your command ship. I suggest you record it. Your superiors will want to understand what happened here." The transmission that reached the Dominion's fist was unlike anything in hegemony military archives. It wasn't a surrender or a threat. It was a testament, delivered by beings who had already passed beyond conventional mortality. "We are the remnants of Battle Group Omega," Corvin began, his image flickering as quantum interference disrupted the signal. 700 ships went into the Crimson Nebula 5 years ago. 40,000 souls trusted their leaders to bring them home. We are what remains of that trust. 7 ships, 231 crew members who have spent 5 years learning what happens when you push beyond the boundaries of the possible. Behind him, the bridge of the tenacious Dawn was a study in controlled chaos. Consoles sparked with overloaded circuits. The air itself glowed with exotic radiation, and his crew worked with the mechanical precision of those who had long since accepted their fate. "You call us the Ghost Fleet," he continued, "and perhaps that's appropriate. We died in that nebula. Not our bodies, but everything that made us human in any conventional sense. What you face now are echoes, powered by grief and sustained by the need to ensure that our sacrifice had meaning." On the Valiant Sword, Commander Ray's Kellerton felt his ship's structural integrity failing as the quantum resonance reached critical levels. The modifications they had made to their vessels allowed them to channel impossible energies, but each use burned away more of what remained of their humanity. His crew of 37 had been reduced to 19 over the past year, not through enemy action, but through the inexorable toll of existing partially outside normal space-time. "Sir," his tactical officer reported, her voice eerily calm despite the fact that her neural pathways were literally burning out. "Quantum coherence at maximum. All ships ready for final transition. The Ghost Fleet's ultimate weapon wasn't their phasing technology or their weaponized quantum fields. It was their willingness to sacrifice not just their lives, but their very existence to achieve their objectives. Normal crews would have retreated, would have found another way, would have preserved themselves for future battles. But the Ghost Fleet had already died once, and what remained was pure purpose distilled into human form. "All ships," Corvin commanded, "across the quantum resonance field, execute Protocol Omega." The 7 ships began to move toward each other, their quantum fields merging and amplifying until the space between them ceased to have meaning in any conventional sense. They were creating a localized singularity, not of matter, but of possibility itself. Every potential future, every quantum state, every possible outcome was being compressed into a single point of infinite potential. Admiral Vex Thara watched in fascinated horror as the human ships began to merge not physically, but conceptually. They were becoming a single entity that existed in 7 locations simultaneously, a distributed consciousness that wielded the fundamental forces of the universe as weapons. "What are they doing?" she whispered. The answer came in the form of a quantum pulse that propagated outward from the merged Ghost Fleet at the speed of causality itself. As it struck each hegemony vessel, the wave didn't destroy them. It convinced the universe that they had already been destroyed, had never existed, had been nothing more than brief fluctuations in the quantum foam. One by one, the surviving ships of Vexithara's fleet simply ceased. Not exploded, not vaporized, ceased. Their matter was converted directly back into the potential energy from which it had originally emerged, leaving behind only confused radiation patterns and the echo of what had once been solid reality, but the Ghost Fleet paid the ultimate price for their victory. As the quantum resonance reached its peak, the 7 ships began to fade from normal space-time. They had pushed so far beyond the boundaries of the possible that they could no longer maintain coherent existence in conventional reality. "Captain." Corvin felt his consciousness expanding across dimensions he had no names for as his ship completed its transition. Around him, his crew smiled with the satisfaction of a mission accomplished, their augmented bodies finally releasing them from the burden of existence. "For those who cannot be forgotten," he whispered, and the Ghost Fleet completed its final dance. The silence that followed was profound, not the absence of sound, but the absence of possibility itself. Admiral Vexithara found herself alone in a region of space that had been fundamentally altered by what she had witnessed. Her flagship, the Dominion's Fist, was the only survivor of a fleet that moments before had commanded overwhelming superiority. Around her, empty space held the faint quantum echoes of vessels that had simply been convinced to stop existing. But more disturbing than the destruction was what had taken the place of the Ghost Fleet. where 7 human ships had made their final sacrifice, space itself had been altered. The quantum distortions had stabilized into something unprecedented, a permanent memorial written into the fabric of reality itself. Anyone who entered this region of space would feel it. The echo of beings who had transcended mortality through sheer force of will. "Admiral," Zixandra whispered, her voice full of awe and terror. "I'm reading. I'm not sure how to describe it. The quantum background radiation has been permanently altered. It's as if the space itself remembers what happened here." Vexthara stared at the readings, trying to comprehend the implications. The Ghost Fleet hadn't just died. They had transformed their destruction into something that would endure long after the stars themselves burned out. They had literally written themselves into the fundamental structure of the universe. The sensor readings were impossible to interpret through conventional physics, but their meaning was clear to anyone who looked upon them. Here stood beings who refused to be forgotten. 3 days later, the first hegemony investigation team arrived to find Admiral Vexithara's flagship drifting powerless at the edge of the quantum anomaly. When they boarded the Dominion's Fist, they found the Admiral in her command chamber, staring at the impossible readings on her displays with the hollow gaze of someone who had witnessed the universe rewrite itself. "Admiral," the investigation team leader, Commander Pelthok, approached cautiously. "High Command requires your immediate report on the engagement." Vexithara turned slowly, her tentacles hanging limp with exhaustion. "Engagement?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "There was no engagement, Commander. There was transcendence." The official report that reached Hegemony High Command 3 hours later would become one of the most classified documents in their archives. It told of 7 human vessels that had somehow destroyed an entire fleet through means that violated known physics. But more importantly, it told of beings who had found a way to transform their deaths into something eternal. Within a week, every military force in the sector had received the same warning. Avoid the Kepler 442c system at all costs. The quantum anomaly that marked the Ghost Fleet's final battle had become a navigational hazard that would persist for millennia, a lighthouse of impossible physics that served as a permanent reminder of what happened when humanity was pushed beyond its breaking point. But the true impact of the Ghost Fleet's sacrifice wasn't measured in territory gained or enemies defeated. It was measured in the stories that began to spread across the galaxy, whispered tales of human ships that fought beyond death, of crews who had found a way to make their extinction into a victory that would echo through eternity. On distant human colonies, children would learn the names of Captain Dre Corvin and his crew, though the names themselves had been lost to quantum dissolution. They would learn that 7 ships had faced impossible odds and chosen to transform their defeat into legend. They would learn that sometimes the greatest victory wasn't survival. It was ensuring that your sacrifice had meaning. The Zephyrian hegemony never again challenged human territory. Neither did the Consortium of Unified Worlds, the Stellar Republic, or any of the other powers that had dismissed humanity as a minor threat. The story of the Ghost Fleet spread faster than light itself, carried by traders and diplomats who spoke in hushed tones of the battle at Kepler 442c and in the quantum anomaly that had once been a battlefield. Something stirred. Not ghosts, not spirits, but pure purpose made manifest in the structure of space-time itself. Occasionally, ships that passed too close to the distortion would receive brief transmissions, not words, but impressions of unshakable determination, of love strong enough to defy entropy itself, of beings who had chosen to become legends rather than accept defeat. The galaxy had learned a fundamental truth that day. Humanity's greatest weapon wasn't their technology, their numbers, or their tactical brilliance. It was their absolute refusal to be forgotten. their willingness to pay any price to ensure that their stories would endure long after their flesh had returned to stardust. In the end, the Ghost Fleet had achieved something that no conventional military victory could have accomplished. They had transformed themselves into mythology, written their names into the quantum foam itself, and created a legend that would inspire and terrify for generations to come. The mockery had indeed ended abruptly when the tiny fleet raised the human flag. But what followed wasn't just victory. It was the birth of immortality, earned through sacrifice so profound that it had rewritten the rules of existence itself. And in the depths of space, where 7 ships had chosen to become eternal, the universe itself remembered their names.